Chapter 2: The Conception and the Genetic Theory of Libido. The chief source of history of the analytic conception of libido is Freud's three contributions to the sexual theory. There, the term libido was conceived by him in the original narrow sense of sexual impulse, sexual need. Experience forces us to the assumption of the capacity for displacement of the libido. These functions of the localizations of non-sexual force, and undoubtedly capable of taking up a certain amount of libidinous sexual impetus, a libidinous flux. Functions or objects would therefore obtain sexual value, which under normal circumstances really have nothing to do with sexuality. From this fact results the Freudian comparison of the libido with a stream which is divisible, which can be dammed up, which overflows into branches, and so on. Freud's original conception does not interpret everything sexual, although this has been asserted by critics, but recognizes the existence of certain forces, the nature of which are not well known, to which Freud, however, compelled by the notorious facts that are evident to any layman, grants the capacity to receive the fluxes of libido. The hypothetical idea at the basis is a symbol of a trabecular bundle of impulses wherein the sexual impulse figures as a partial impulse of the whole system, and its enroachment into the other realms of impulse is a fact of experience. The theory of Freud branching off from this interpretation, according to which the motor forces of a neurotic system correspond precisely to their libidinous additions to other non-sexual functional impulses, has been sufficiently proven as correct. It seems to me by the work of Freud and his school since the appearance of the three contributions in 1905, a change has taken place. In the libido conception, its field of application has been widened. An extremely clear example of the amplification is this present work. However, I must state that Freud as well as myself saw the need of widening the conception of libido. It was paranoia, so closely related to dementia precox, which seemed to compel Freud to enlarge the earlier limits of the conception. The passage in question, which I quote here, word for word reads, "A third consideration which presents itself in regard to the views developed here starts to query as to whether we should accept as sufficiently effectual the universal recedings of the libido from the outer world, in order to interpret from that the end of a word, or whether in this case the firmly rooted possession of the eye must not suffice to uphold the rapport with the outer world, when the one must either let that which we call possession of libido, interest from erotic sources, coincide with interest in general, or else take into consideration the possibility that great disturbance in the disposition of libido can also induce a corresponding disturbance in the possession of the eye. Now these are the problems which we are still absolutely helpless and unfitted to answer. Things would be different when we proceed from safe fund of knowledge of instinct, but the truth is we have nothing of that kind at our disposal. We understand instinct as the resultant of the reaction of the somatic and the psychic. We see in the physical representation of organic forces and other popular distinction between the eye impulse and the sexual impulse, which appears to us to be in accord with the biological double role of the individual being who aspires to his own preservation, as well as the preservation of the species. But anything beyond this is a structure which we set up, and also willingly yet fall again in order to orient ourselves in the confusion of the dark processes of the soul. We expect particularly from the psychoanalytic investigations in the diseased soul possesses to have certain decision forced upon us in regard to questions of the theory of instinct. This expectation has not yet been fulfilled on account of the still immature and limited investigations in these fields. At present, the possibility of reaction of libido disturbance upon the possession of the eye can be shown as little as the reverse. The secondary or reduced disturbances of a libido processes through abnormal changes in the eye. It is probable that processes of this sort form the distinctive character of a psychosis. The conclusions arising from this in relation to paranoia are at present uncertain. One cannot assert that paranoia has completely withdrawn his interest from the outer world, nor withdrawn into the heights of repression, as one sometimes sees in certain other forms of hallucinatory psychosis. He takes notice of our outer world. He takes account of its changes. He is stirred to explanations by our influence, and therefore I consider it highly probable that he exchanged relation to the world is to be explained wholly or in great part by the deficiency of a libido interest. In this passage, Freud plainly touches up the question whether the well-known longing for reality of paranoid dement and the dementia precox patients, to whom I have especially called attention in my book, The Psychology of Dementia Precox, is to be traced back to the withdrawal of the libidinous effluxes alone, or whether this coincides with the so-called objective interest in general. It is hardly to be assumed that the normal fantasie du real Janet is maintained only through fluxes of libido or erotic interest. The fact is that in very many cases reality disappears entirely, so that not a trace of psychological adaptation or orientation can be recognized. Reality is repressed under these circumstances and replaced by the contents of the complex. One must of necessity say that not only the erotic interest, but the interest in general has disappeared, that is to say, the whole adaptation really has ceased. To this category belong the stupros and catatonic automations. I have previously made use of the expression psychic energy in my Psychology of Dementia Precox, yet was unable to establish a theory of the psychosis upon the conception of the displacement of the effluxes of the libido. My experience at that time, chiefly psychiatric, did not enable me to understand this theory. However, the correctness of this theory in regard to neurosis, strictly speaking the transference neurosis, was proven to me later after increased experience in the field of hysteria and compulsion neurosis. In the territory of these neuroses, it is mainly a question whether any portion of the libido which is spared through the specific repression becomes introverted and regressive in the earlier paths of transference. For example, the path of the parental transference. With that, however, the former non-sexual psychologic adaptation to the environment remains preserved so far as it does not concern the erotic and its secondary position symptoms. The reality which is lacking to the patients is just that portion of the libido can be found in neurosis. In dementia precox, on the contrary, not merely that portion of libido which is saved in the well-known specific sexual repression is lacking for reality, but much more than one could write down to the account of sexuality in a strict sense. The function of reality is lacking to such a degree that even the motive power must be encroached upon and lost. The sexual character of this must be disputed absolutely, for reality is not understood to be a sexual function. Moreover, if that were so, the introversion of the libido in the strict sense must as a result a loss of reality in the neurosis, and indeed a loss which could be compared with that of dementia precox. These facts has rendered it impossible for me to transfer Freud's theory of libido to dementia precox, and therefore I am of opinion that Abraham's investigation is hardly tenable theoretically, from the standpoint of the Freudian theory of libido. If Abraham believes that through the withdrawal of the libido from the outer world, the paranoid system, or a schizophrenic symptomology result, then this assumption is not justified from the standpoint of the knowledge of that time. Because a mere libido introversion and regression leads speedily, as Freud has clearly shown, into the neurosis, and strictly speaking into the transference neurosis and not into the dementia precox. Therefore, the transference of the libido theory to dementia precox is impossible, because this illness produces a loss of reality which cannot be explained by the deficiency of a libido defined in this narrow sense. It affords me special satisfaction that our teacher also, when he laid his hand on the delicate material of the Pyrrhonic psychology, was forced to doubt the applicability of the conception of libido held by him at that time. The sexual definition of this did not permit me to understand those disturbances of function which affect the vague territory of the hunger instinct, just as such as that of sexual instinct. For a long time the theory of libido seemed to me inapplicable to dementia precox. With increasingly experience in analytical work, however, I became aware of gradual changes in my conception of libido, in place of a descriptive definition of the three contributions, there gradually grew up a generic definition of libido, which rendered it possible for me to replace the expression psychic energy by the term libido. I was forced to ask myself whether indeed the functions of reality today does not consist only in a smaller part of libido sexualis and in a greater part of other impulses. It is still a very important question whether phylogenetically the function of reality is not, at least in great part, of sexual origin. To answer this question directly in regard to the function of reality is not possible, but we shall attempt to an understanding indirectly. A fleeting glance at the history of evolution is sufficient to teach us that countless complicated functions, which today must be denied to any sexual character, were originally pure derivations of a general impulse of propagation. During the ascent through the animal kingdom, an important displacement in the fundamentals of the procreative instinct has taken place. The mass of reproductive products, with the uncertainty of fertilization, has more and more been replaced by a controlled impregnation and an effective protection of the offspring. In this way, part of the energy required in the production of eggs and sperm has been transported into the creation of mechanisms for allurement and for protection of the young. Thus we discover the first instincts of art and animal used in the service of the impulse of creation, and limited to the breeding season. The original sexual character of these biological institutions became lost in their organic fixation and functional independence. Even if there can be no doubt about the sexual origin of music, still it would be a poor unesthetic generalization if one were to include music in the category of sexuality. A similar nomenclature would then lead us to classify the Cathedral of Cologne as mineralogy, as it is built of stones. It can be a surprise only to those to whom the history of evolution is known, to find how few things there really are in human life which cannot be reduced in the last analysis of the instinct of procreation. It includes very nearly everything, I think, which is beloved and dear to us. We spoke just now of libido as the creative impulse, and at the same time we allied ourselves with the conception which opposes libido to hunger, in the same way that the instinct of the preservation of the species is opposed to the instinct of self-preservation. In nature, this artificial distinction does not exist. Here we see only a continuous life impulse, a will to live, which will attain the creation of the whole species through the preservation of the individual. Thus far, this conception coincides with the idea of the will in Schopenhauer, for we can conceive will objectively only as a manifestation of an internal desire. This throwing of psychological perceptions into material reality is characterized philosophically as introjection. Ferenczi's conception of introjection denotes the reverse, that is, the taking of the outer world into the inner world. Naturally, the conception of a world was distorted by introjection. Freud's conception of a principle of desire is voluntary formulation of the idea of introjectionism, while his once more voluntarily conceived principle of reality corresponds functionally to that which I designate as corrective of reality, and Rar Aveneris designates as the conception of power owes the existence to this very injection. This has already been said expressively by Galileo in his remark that its origin is to be sought in the subjective perception of the muscular power of the individual. Because we have already arrived at the daring assumption that the libido, which was employed originally in the exclusive service of egg and seed production, now appears firmly organized in the function of nestle building and can no longer be employed otherwise. Similarly, this conception forces us to relate it to every desire, including hunger. For now we can no longer make any essential distinction between the will to build a nest and the will to eat. This view brings us to a conception of libido, which extends over the boundaries of the physical sciences into a philosophical aspect to a conception of the will in general. I must give this bit of psychological voluntary remittance into the hands of philosophers for them to manage. For the rest, I refer to the words of Schopenhauer relating to this. In connection with the psychology of this conception, by which I understand neither metapsychology nor metaphysics, I am reminded here of the cosmogonic meaning of Eros in Plato and Hesiod, and also of the orphanic figure of Phanes, the Shining One, the first created the father of Eros. Phanes has also orphanically the significance of Proprius. He is a god of love, bisexual, and similar to the Theban Dionysus, Lysos. The Orphic meaning of Phanes is similar to that of the Indian Kama, the god of love, which is also the cosmogonic principle. To Plinius, the Neoplatonical school, the world soul is the energy of the intellect. Plotinus compares the one, the creative primal principle, with light in general, the intellect with the sun. The world soul with the moon. In another comparison, Plotinus compares the one with the father, the intellect with the sun. The one designates as Uranus is transcendent, the sun is Kronos, has dominion over the visible world. The world soul designates as Zeus, appears as subordinate to him. The one, or the Ursa of the whole existence, is designated by Plotinus as hyperstatic. Also as the three forms of emanation. As Druze observe, this is also the formula of the Christian Trinity: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, as was decided upon at the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. It may also be noticed that certain early Christian secretaries attributed the maternal significance to the Holy Ghost. World Soul Moon. See what follows according to G of Timaeus. According to Plotinus, the world's soul was a tendency towards a divided existence and towards divisibility, the contitus sine qua non of all change, creation, and procreation. Also a maternal quality, it is an unending all of life and holy energy. It is a living organism of ideas which attain in its effectiveness in reality. The intellect is this procreator, its father, which having conceived it brings it to development in thought. What lies enclosed to the intellect comes to development in the world's soul, as Logos fills it with meaning and makes it as intoxicated with nectar. Nectar is analogous to soma, the drink of fertility and of life, also to sperm. The soul is fructified by the intellect. As oversoul, it is called heavenly Aphrodite, and the undersoul of earthly Aphrodite. It knows the birth pangs, and so on. The birth of Aphrodite, the dove, is not without good cause, the symbol of the Holy Ghost. This fragment of the history of philosophy, which may easily be enlarged, shows the significance of the endopsychic perception of a libido and its symbolism in human thought. In the diversity of natural phenomena, we see the desire of a libido in the most diverse applications and forms. We see the libido in the stage of childhood, almost wholly occupied in an instinct of nutrition, which takes care of the upbuilding of the body. With the development of the body, there are successively opened new spheres of application for the libido. The last sphere of application, and surpassing all the others in its functional significance, is sexuality, which seems at first almost bound up with the function of nutrition. Compare with this the influence on procreation of the conditions of nutrition in lower animals and plants. In the territory of sexuality, the libido wins the formation, the enormous importance of which has justified in the use of the term libido in general. Here the libido appears very properly as an impulse of procreation, and almost in the form of an undifferentiated sexual primal libido, as an energy of growth which clearly forces the individual towards division, budding, and etc. The clearest distinction between the two forms of libido is to be found amongst those animals in whom the stage of nutrition is separated from the sexual stage by chrysalis stage. From that sexual primal libido which produced millions of eggs and seeds from one small creature, derivatives have been employed with the greatest limitation of the fecundancy, derivatives in which the functions are manifested by a special differentiated libido. This differentiated libido is henceforth desexualized because of the dissociation from the original function of egg and sperm production. Any possibility of restoring it to its original function. Thus, in general, the process of development consists in an increasing transformation of a primal libido, which only produce products of generation to the secondary functions of allurement and protection of a young. This now presupposes a very different and very complicated relation to reality. A true function of reality, which functionality inseparable is bound up with the needs of procreation. Thus the altered mode of procreation carries with it, as a correlate, a correspondingly heightened adaptation to reality. In this way, we attain an insightful into certain primitive conditions of the function of reality. It would be radically wrong to say that its compelling power is a sexual one. It was a sexual one to a large extent. The process of transformation of a primal libido into secondary impulses always took place into the form of fluxes of sexual libido. That is to say, sexuality became deflected from its original destination, and a portion of it turned little by little, increasing in amount into the phylogenic, impulsive mechanism of allurement and of protection of the young. The diversion of sexual libido from the sexual territory into associated functions is still taking place. Where this operation succeeds without injury to the adaptation of the individual is called sublimation. Where the attempt does not succeed, it is called repression. The descriptive standpoint of psychology accepts the multiplicity of instincts, among which is the sexual instinct, as a special phenomenon. Moreover, it recognizes certain effluxes of libido to non-sexual instincts. Quite otherwise is the genetic standpoint. It regards the multiplicity of instincts as issuing from a relative unity, the primal libido. It recognizes the definite amounts of primal libido are split off, as it were, associated with the newly formed functions and finally merged in them. As a result of this, it is impossible from the genetic standpoint to hold on to the strictly limited conceptual libido of the descriptive standpoint. It leads inevitably to a broadcasting of the conception. With this we come to the theory of libido that I have superstitiously introduced into the first part of this work for the purpose of making the genetic conception familiar to the reader. The explanation of this harmless deceit I have saved until the second part. For the first time, through this genetic idea of libido, which is in every way surpasses the descriptive sexual, the transference was made possible for the Freudian libido theory into the psychology of a mental disease. The passage quoted above shows how the present Freudian conception of libido collides with the problem of the psychosis. Therefore, when I speak of libido, I associate with it the genetic conception which contains not only the immediate sexual, but also an amount of desexualized primal libido. When I say a sick person takes his libido away from the outer world in order to take possession of the inner world with it, I do not mean that he takes away merely the effluxes from the function of reality, but he takes the energy away according to my view, from those desexualized instincts which regularly and properly support the function of reality. With this alteration in the libido conception, certain parts of our terminology need revision as well. As we know, Abraham has undertaken the experiment of transferring the Freudian libido theory to dementia praecox with a conceived the characteristic lack of report and the cessation of the function of reality as autoeroticism. This conception needs revision. Hysterical introversion of the libido leads to autoeroticism, since the patient's erotic efflux of libido, designed for the function of adaptation, is introverted, whereby his ego is occupied by the corresponding amount of erotic libido. The schizophrenic, however, shuns reality far more than merely the erotic efflux would account for. Therefore, his inner condition is very different from that of the hysteric. He is more of an autoerotic. He builds up an intrapsychic equivalent for reality, for which purpose he has necessarily to employ other dynamics than that afforded by the erotic efflux. Therefore, I must grant to Bleuer the right to reject the conception of autoeroticism taken from the study of hysterical neurosis and their legitimate, and replace it by its conception of automesis. I am forced to say that this term is better fitted to facts than autoeroticism. With this I acknowledge my early idea that identity of autosmus Bleuer and autoeroticism which is Freud is unjustified, and therefore retract it. This thorough revision of the conception of libido has compelled me to this. From these considerations, it follows necessarily that the descriptive psychological conception of libido must be given up in order for the libido theory to be applied to dementia praecox. That is, their applicable is best shown in Freud's brilliant investigation of Scherber's fantasies. The question now is whether this genetic conception of libido proposed by me is suitable for the neurosis. I believe that this question may be answered affirmatively. The Truman non festus solem is not merely to be expected, but it is also probable that at least temporary functional disturbances of various degrees appear in the neurosis, which transcend the boundaries of the immediate sexual in any case. This occurs in psychotic episodes. I considered a broadening of the conception of a libido, which is developed through the most recent analytical work, as a real advance, which will prove of a special advantage in the important fields of the introversion psychosis. Proofs of the correctness of my assumptions are already at hand. It has become apparent through a series of researches of the Zurich School, which are now published in part, that the phanecytic substitution produced, which take the place of a disturbed function of reality, bear unmistakable traces of archaic thought. This confirmation is parallel to the postulate asserted above, according to which reality is deprived not merely of an immediate individual amount of libido, but also of an already differentiated or desexualized quantity of libido, which among normal people has belonged to the function of reality. Ever since prehistoric times, a dropping away from the last acquisition of function of reality or adaptation must of necessity be replaced by an earlier mode of adaptation. We find this principle unmistakable traces of archaic thought. This confirmation is parallel to the postulate asserted above, according to which reality is deprived not merely of an immediate individual amount of libido, but also of an already differentiated or desexualized quantity of libido, which among normal people has belonged to the function of reality ever since prehistoric times. A dropping away of the last acquisition of the function of reality or adaptation must of necessity be replaced by an earlier mode of adaptation. We find this principle already in the doctrines of a neurosis, that is, that a repression resulting from the failures of a recent transference is replaced by an old way of transference, namely through a regressive revival of the parent imago. In the transference neurosis hysterical, where merely a part of the immediate sexual libido is taken away from reality by the specific sexual repression. The substituted product is a fantasy of the individual origin and significance. If only a trace of those archaic traits found in the fantasies of those mental disorders, in which a portion of a general human function of reality organized since antiquity has broken off. This portion can be replaced only by a generally valid archaic surrogate. We owe a simple and clear example of this proposition to the investigation of Honegger, a paranoiac of good intelligence who has a clear idea of the spherical form of the earth and its rotation around the sun replaces the modern astronomical views by a system worked out in great detail, which one must call archaic, in which the earth is a flat disk over which the sun travels. I am reminded of the sun phallus mentioned in the first part of this book, for which we are also indebted to Honegger. Sphyrlin has likewise furnished some very interesting examples of archaic definitions which begin in certain illnesses to overlay the real meanings of the modern world. For example, Sphyrlin's patient had correctly discovered the mythological significance of alcohol, the intoxicating drink, to be an effusion of seed. She also had a symbolism of boiling, which I must place parallel to the especially important alchemistic vision of Zoismos, found people in boiling water within the cavity of the altar. This patient used earth in place of mother, and also water to express mother. I refrain from further examples because future work of the Zurich School will furnish abundant evidence of this sort. My foregoing proposition of a replacement of a disturbed function of reality by an archaic surrogate is supported by an excellent paradox of Sphyrlin's. She says, I often had the illusion that these patients might be simply victims of folk superstition. As a matter of fact, patients substitute fantasies for reality, fantasies similar to the actually incorrect mental products of the past, which however were once the view of reality. As the Zoisimone's vision shows, the old superstitions were symbols which permitted transitions to the most remote territory. This must have been very expedient for certain archaic periods, for by this means convenient bridges were often to lead to as partial amount of libido over into the mental realm. Evidently, Spearlin thinks of a similar biological meaning of the symbols when he says, "Thus the symbol seems to me to owe its origin in general to the tendency of a complex for dissolution in the common totality of thought. The complex is derived by that of a personal element. This tendency towards dissolution, transformation of every individual complex is the motive for poetry, painting, for every sort of art. When here we replace the formal conception of complex by the conception of the quantity of libido, the total effect of the complex, which form the standpoint of libido theory, is as a justified measure, then does Spearlin's view easily agree with mine. When primitive man understands in general what an act of generation is, then according to the principle of the path of least resistance, he never can arrive at the idea of replacing the generative organs by a sword blade or a shuttle. But this is the case with certain Indians, who explain the origin of mankind by the union of two transference symbols. He then must be compelled to devise an analogous thing in order to bring a manifest sexual interest upon an asexual expression. This propelling motive of this transition of the immediate sexual libido to the non-sexual representation can, in my opinion, be found only in resistance which opposes primitive sexuality. It appears as if by this means of fantastic analogy formation, more libido would gradually become desexualized because increasingly more fantasy correlates were put into place of the primitive achievement of the sexual libido. With this, an enormous broadening of the world idea was gradually developed because new objects were always assimilated as sexual symbols. It is a question whether the human consciousness has not yet been brought into its present state entirely, or in great part in this manner. It is evident in any case that an important significance in the development of the human mind is due to the impulse towards the discovery of analogy. We must agree fairly with Steinfall when he says that an absolutely overweening importance must be granted to the little phrase, "like we," even as in the history of the development of thought. It is easy to believe that the carryover of libido to a fantasitic correlate has led primitive man to a number of the most important discoveries.